Hi, and good morning to everyone in the Americas, and good afternoon to everyone else joining us from around the world. Thanks for showing interest in our latest product launch here for Safran Risk Manager. And just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Christ Ritson, and I've been living and breathing a career in project risk for over 14 years in major infrastructure here in the UK, in the United Kingdom. And over those years, I've used several products, different risk software tools as mandated by various customers. And I always find some process friction that is never adequately addressed by the software. And we're often required to use that software. So I find this quite curious. And what I'm really talking about here is arguably the most important step in the risk management process, which for me is step one. But before I explain this in any detail properly, I'm just going to start by answering some more basic questions like, why did Safran feel the need to make another piece of risk software? So you may be familiar with our scheduling platform, Safran Project, or perhaps Safran Risk for your probabilistic schedule and cost risk modeling needs. However, a typical risk register used on a project might contain various ownership, categorization, subjective assessment fields that would be considered entirely superfluous for modeling purposes. And these are in fact entirely absent from Safran Risk. So actually, there was a gap in our offering. So what are the key differences between Safran Risk and Safran Risk Manager? Well, as I've just mentioned, Safran Risk's risk register is streamlined to reduce the time needed to create and run a sophisticated risk model, which is relevant if you're only running them once per month or needing to make lots of alternative scenarios. But it will typically be driven by one or two specialists on a single project or across a small portfolio that they oversee. However, Safran Risk Manager captures all kinds of additional attributes to help you spot patterns and can be used any time of day, accessed via a web browser on your laptop or perhaps your mobile phone, and by anyone associated on that project working across a wider portfolio. Of course, they also share some of that same coding in their DNA and have the following similarities that go beyond just utilizing the same Monte Carlo algorithms. They're both designed around real-life workflows to make the tool easier to use, which is so important for everyday team members and seasoned risk managers alike. They both provide clear feedback and guide users towards superior quality and consistency of the data entered. And both very much build on these two aspects to foster greater collaboration, which is an essential aspect of the increasingly complex project delivery that we're now seeing. So in effect, when paired, they can become complementary twin tools if your project requires both aspects. So who's Risk Manager for? Well, I've just identified one type of customer on that previous slide, those that require both the qualitative and the quantitative schedule risk methods to work harmoniously together and are in all probability an existing Safran Risk customer who just needs more, and Safran Risk Manager will provide that sweet spot for them. But our expectation is that there will be lots of teams and projects out there who've been using Excel spreadsheets for their risk management needs, maybe only in the most basic qualitative sense. And they're looking for an easy way to upgrade their consistency, their security, and accessibility of approach in a way that doesn't feel too dissimilar from a Microsoft Excel sheet. So we've purposefully created a user interface that mimics some of those aspects whilst enhancing what can be achieved. Of course, there's also another subset of spreadsheet users where they start introducing quantitative modeling, and things can quickly escalate in terms of complexity and difficulty, which may be unhelpful for some people in the project team. Then there's those that have already have investigated and invested in other day-to-day risk management databases. Now, for many, what they have is already working perfectly well for them, and they may just require Safran Risk to give them a boost and enable integrated schedule and cost risk modeling, for instance. But for others, some others, we know that they're already looking to switch from their risk-centric approach that they've been typical of the last couple of decades. They've seen their return on investment plateauing for risk management. Risk managers are increasingly looking for a tool that is consistent with what they truly know to be correct. That targeted risk-centric approaches are absolutely necessary for the significant risks, but not all risks are equal, and a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work. And this can actually be leading to distracting resources away from ensuring that the project outcomes are actually even met. So Safran Risk Manager should appeal to these people in the projects that are seeking easier and more holistic approaches. Okay, so I've just used a little bit of a buzzword there, and I feel obliged to explain what I mean by holistic. So holism, the theory that parts of a whole are intimately connected such that they cannot exist or be understood independently of that whole. So each project is a unique organism. It has its own unique ecosystem, relationships, and contexts, and this is the foundational language of complexity. And I'm sure that many of you have noticed that the typical project of today is more complex than it was, say, 10 plus years ago. And this is part of the reason why traditional approaches to managing risk are plateauing, because they cannot keep track of the sheer number of relationships that all things have with all other things. And this is further compounded by what feels like the increased pace and intensity of change management and scope creep on the modern project. So now there are many ways to achieve holism across your projects and keeping everybody across all of the project teams focused on just those uncertainties that really do in fact matter, which is those risks that affect the project's objectives. So if I was to highlight just a few areas in Safran Risk Manager that will help you do this, I'd say, first, we give you the space to consider your project's objectives and make them explicitly linkable to your various project risks. And after all, if you are not in pursuit of an opportunity or reward of some kind, then nothing can be at risk. Secondly, whoever has the authority to decide which risks are the priorities, they will receive a proportion. Sorry, they will receive a portion of their constrained resources. So what we can do is we can simplify that by toggling a high-low flag, and that will act as both an escalation feature, but also feature in part of the reporting tool, which, such as here on the real-time dashboard, it gives a simple way to enact the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle, if you prefer. Thirdly, we appreciate that there are often times when having multiple scoring systems to represent many different perspectives is important. Assessing a risk for how it affects the immediate work package can take on an entirely different meaning through, say, the lens of the global enterprise. And fourth, unlike many other risk tools, Safran Risk Manager will actually calculate and visualize a cost-benefit model for your proposed treatment actions to help decision makers see the net benefit of every dollar spent yielding a return on investment. As I suggested earlier, mature risk systems don't want to work harder, they want to work smarter and intelligently target their efforts. So perhaps not the traditional sensitivity or tornado chart that you may have come to expect from a Monte Carlo capable tool, but perhaps the one that is most surprisingly absent and yet most crucially needed and required. Fifth, SRM gives whoever's curating and administering your risk approach the ability to offer interpretation of the data and make recommendations. So rather than just creating a report that simply states facts and figures, it can be brought to life with story and narrative to become more engaging, more memorable, frankly, more useful. Otherwise, the risk process can become stale and accidentally become one-way traffic and miss the opportunity for people to sense and respond to the aggregated big picture. SRM also prompts and encourages lessons learned and general observations to be captured when closing out risks. What worked well or not as expected, or more fundamentally, what would you do differently next time? Now, all 5 of these themes that I've just shown you have 2 particular things in common. They're all available through SRM's reporting, particularly the real-time dashboard, and they all seek to make the implicit explicit. I've worked on so many projects where perhaps if people were able to show the connections between all of the things that they knew to other people on the project, then those projects would perhaps perform better. Well, Safran Risk Manager gives you a permanent and consistent way of connecting all of these dots for the benefit of others in your team. So this is where I'm going to throw in a sixth bonus highlight, because this is actually my favorite part of the whole system. Now, I alluded to this earlier, that perhaps project professionals are feeling like they're not addressing the correct risks and uncertainties. Or maybe it's because they've been exhaustively micromanaging them in the risk-centric way, rather than taking a step back and reviewing from a top-down macro project perspective. So SRM introduces project change, assumptions, dependencies, exclusions, and constraints into your risk management approach, so that all sources of a risk and uncertainty can be mapped back to a single situation, or understood as a significant underlying root cause that may be driving many of your specific risks, but treating them may be more cost effective by firing a silver bullet at the source rather than treating the very many symptoms. Okay, so why am I personally excited about SRM? I suggested back in my introduction that SRM does a great job of delivering on step one of the typical risk management process. But I'm not actually talking about risk identification. I'm actually describing the step that becomes before it, what the Association for Project Management call initiate, or what ISO 31000 now refers to as scope, context, and criteria. Now, for me, and I'm sure for many of you, we can agree that step one is liable to fluctuate due to a sister risk management process that's better known as change management. And across all projects, as new or hidden information is revealed, a change to the project's requirements, context may occur as frequently as every day or every month, depending on the size and complexity of the scope. But the way the traditional project risk processes have addressed this interface has often been inadequate, or more likely just entirely absent. And now I'm going to explain a significant part of why I believe this is. Every project that I've ever worked on here in the UK has had to write and sign off on a risk management plan. This is the document that outlines which people will do whichever things as part of the process, and which tools they'll use to do so, and in what order. It will typically start with a chapter that explains why risk management is important and how it's going to help this particular project in its particular context yield a particular outcome. So in effect, step one of the risk management process is usually captured in this document. It could be anywhere from 5 to 50 pages long, not necessarily read and understood by everyone on the project. And of course, like all documented management plans, it will be picked up by an auditor once per period and check and police that you're actually indeed doing the things that you originally stated. Now, what that last point about the auditors really means is that of the few people who do actually read and use the risk management plan, they probably only review and edit it once per year themselves, if that. So what I've identified is a piece of mission critical process in step one that is disconnected from the very tools that we use day to day in managing our identified project risks, emergent change, and associated decisions. So I'm hoping that you're beginning to see that, as I do, that step one and change management can actually operate on a different clock speed to other parts of the risk management process that might be following on a slower track. And as I've been illustrating this to some well-respected heads of risk here in the UK, I'm finding that they agree with me. So by bringing those parts of step one back inside the software, they can be made visible, accessible, and updated in real time, to ensure that each subsequent risk review does so within an up-to-date context for each connected ADEC and change linked to objectives. So perhaps you too can now see why designing a risk management tool that seeks to make the implicit explicit can be so influential in enabling a team to collaborate around a shared understanding of the project's ever-changing context and associated risks. SRM transcends that traditional risk-centric approach by balancing them against the project's objectives and desired outcomes, which in turn will help you make intelligent decisions with respect to mitigation measures and opportunities. And of course, you can always then pair it up with Safran Risk for alternative scenario analysis. So to summarize, Safran Risk Manager gives you the advantages of a database, consistency, access, security, the sweet spot between ease of use and extra value added, and of course, the holism, or making the implicit explicit, as naturally as possible and for the benefit of everyone on the project. Okay, so before we demonstrate some of Safran Risk Manager in action with Mark Turner, and we'll handle some of your most asked audience questions, I just want to point out that safran.com has some excellent blog articles on today's themes, and that of course, if you want to schedule a more detailed demonstration for the rest of your team, or just require more information about Safran Risk Manager, then please contact us. But as we'd love to hear your feedback, please also expect a representative of Safran to probably connect with you too. Okay, so you've listened to me for about 15 minutes or so now, so if Mark can come and join me and share his screen, and he'll show you our user-friendly interface for quickly raising risks, viewing the risk register like an Excel spreadsheet, and running a portfolio view of the real-time dashboard. And then we can both jump straight into your Q&A for the final 10 minutes or so. So I'm just going to turn my screen share off. Mark, I can't hear you if you're speaking.
Yep. How about now?
There you are. Brilliant.
Thank you, Chris. You're on mute. It's the buzzword of the decade, I think. Thank you very much, Chris. That's very informative. So very much a quick introduction for myself. I'm a bit of risk professional for about 15 years, and I've been working with Safran as their lead on the Safran Risk Management tool for about 2.5 years now. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to share with you some of the developments which we've made with Safran Risk Manager. So if I can get this to work properly, hang on a second. Trouble with these things is they never seem to work exactly as you expect them to. I've lost the window. Chris, can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yeah, I can see the log on screen.
You can see the log on screen. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so whilst I log into Safran Risk Manager, it's worth noting that Safran Risk Manager is a web-based application which Safran can host on your behalf, or it can be hosted on premises within your own servers. Now, I've logged in using my credentials, which allows me to have certain role privileges, and we've constructed the tool so that the role privileges enable either a basic user, and the basic users would be a member of the project team who could create a new risk and to modify the risks which have been allocated to them, and also their actions. Plus, we have these function users, and they include a risk manager, an administrator, and something we call the portfolio viewer. Now, these functional users are the people who would take responsibility for ensuring the quality of the tool and also the quality of the data held within the tool. So it acts as a gatekeeper for the workflow of data going into the tool. But they are really the only controls which we've imposed upon the tool, such that we hope it's flexible enough for each organization to adapt it to their own requirements in their user needs. Now, I've logged onto Safran Risk Manager, and you can see that I'm presenting a number of projects. And it's worth stressing at this point that Safran Risk Manager has been designed specifically for the management of individual projects. However, there's flexibility and capability in there to enable it to be more applicable to portfolios and programs and projects, so that individual projects can reside and be modified and changed within the context of their own separate risk register. So whilst we're looking at a dozen projects here, we have essentially a dozen separate individual risk registers. And the risk register is where I'm going to take you now. So I'm going to select a project and take you into the risk register. The risk registers are presented in a table, which allows us to see the data held for individual risks, very much as you would expect to see it from a traditional Excel spreadsheet. However, more than an Excel spreadsheet, we have introduced the bow tie model, and the bow tie model enables us to collect multiple sources of risk events and multiple impacts should that risk event occur. And the way that we've compressed it into our spreadsheet or into the table on the risk register is, as you can see, the blue boxes here represent my multiple risk sources, and I would simply select a risk source to make a change to it, or I might have multiple risk impacts, and again I can make a selection to make changes to any of those data fields within the register. And you'll also notice we have these shield icons, and the shield icons represent the actions which have been allocated to individuals and have got a different life cycle status. And again, these can be opened and updated directly from the risk register, which is unusual for a database system like this, which would normally require the users to step out of their risk register and make modifications to the risk entry field. Now, if you're anything like me, working in risk management for as many years, there's only so much information that you can derive from seeing the data presented in a table. So what Safran Risk Manager does is it takes this information from your risk register and can convert that into information in a real-time dashboard, as Chris mentioned earlier. And the real-time dashboard is really the heart of the Safran Risk Management tool. It enables the risk professional and the project team to determine both qualitative information about the quality of their risk registers. So for example, we can see how many risks we have which are open or closed. And notice when we talk about risks, we both include threats and opportunities. And we can see how that is affected across, for example, a probability impact matrix. And we're not constrained with just one probability impact matrix, but we can have 2 or 3, each which are individually configurable by the administrator and very much tailorable and configurable to be applicable to your organization. But we don't just stop at the qualitative assessment of our risk register. We can also look at a quantitative assessment. And in this case, we're looking at the cost impacts using a Monte Carlo analysis, which uses the same algorithms as the more sophisticated Safran Risk. Now, the purpose of this visualization is not so much to do a cost risk analysis, but to look at the profile which our risk register has. And we're looking for such things as the long tail, where we have low likelihood, high impact risks, which could be significant and are essentially hidden when looking at a table of data. We also have some further analysis, such as the cost benefit analysis. Because we're capturing information with regards to the actions to be undertaken within our risk, we know what this pre-treatment and its post-treatment position is relative to the amount of money we intend to spend on the action. And using this information, we can target our limited resources to identify the best treatment actions to derive the best benefit on our project. And then finally, we have the ability to categorize our risks and see across the risk register such things as how many risks are being allocated to a function or a risk breakdown structure component or an individual. And not only just looking at how many risks they have, but on the right-hand chart here, we can see how cost impactful those risks are in a pre and post-treatment position. It's worth bearing in mind as well that on this dashboard, we've been looking at a single project, but we're not constrained to do so. We can add other projects to it, and we can add, up to 5 projects. And by simply selecting the refresh button, we have a almost instantaneous calculation. We're now looking at the cumulative values of 5 projects worth of data all in the same dashboard which we're familiar with. And you can see here that I've imported a risk project which has got one of those characteristic long tails that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the dashboard is how we derive information from our risk register. But the last thing I want to talk to you about is how do we get the information and the data into the risk register in the first instance. And we've simplified this process as much as possible so that users within a project team can add new risks wherever they are. And we've made this mobile friendly. So as Chris mentioned, we would anticipate that users would want to identify risks whilst they're out on site, or potentially whilst they're running in a workshop. And by having a configured data entry field which can fit into a mobile platform, we see that as being a very much in your pocket 24/7 ability to create new entries into our risk register. Entries into the risk register are very, very simple. We would create a title, we would identify a source, and we can use these simple slider bars to select a likelihood and an impact. And if you wanted to, that's the minimum requirement for you to create a new entry into the risk register. But we have also additional functionality. Repeating on what Chris said earlier, we can select a priority, and this is more of a qualitative assessment to give you some of that Pareto consideration. And of course, we differentiate between threats and opportunities. So we would anticipate project teams being able to quickly identify potential opportunities as well as threats when creating. Now, when presented with a blank piece of paper to create a new risk register, it's often very difficult to identify the basic risks which need to go onto that risk register. So we've come up with the concept of the global risk. And for those of you who may be familiar with Safran Risk, you'll recognize the concept of global risk. And this is essentially those lessons learned which your organization has captured. And we could use this potentially as a checklist. So selecting one or many of the global risks enables you to rapidly populate your first entry on your risk registers. Once the data has been captured, and I'm going to move into the next stage in the process. So I've captured risks in a basic sense. Now I'm back at my desk and I've got time to think and process what it is that I've captured within my risk. And we've worked through the ISO 31000 standard nomenclature for risk identification and risk assessment. With the idea being that we take the time to populate and configure the identified aspects of the risk, which includes such things as a fuller description, ensuring that an owner has been assigned, when the risk is likely to occur and when it's likely to be completed, how risks are related to each other, and also the categorization, such as which objective of the project is likely to be impacted, when is the risk likely to be impacting, and which function or risk breakdown structure element is impacted by this particular risk event. And all of these aspects are fully configurable by the administrator to make sure that it conforms to your organization's process. And once we're on that step, it's also worth noting that all the words which are presented on the screen can be converted to a local language as well. So if you are working in a global organization where you have multiple languages, it is possible for the default language of your browser to pick up the specific language which your users are operating in. Once we've identified the risks, we then need to take the next step, which is the assessment. And as you can see, the assessment follows the bow tie analysis methodology, such we have multiple sources, multiple impacts, and actions which will be taken to prevent the risk event from occurring, or actions to limit the damage should the risk occur. And once again, the data entry field has been kept as simple as possible, and where possible we would use either qualitative or quantitative assessments for the impact. And it's worth noting that the interoperability between Safran Risk and Safran Risk Manager is tightly bound together in these data identification aspects. So such that we have the multiple distribution curves, which can be used for sophisticated quantitative analysis in Safran Risk. We enter exactly the same data to Safran Risk Manager, which is then used for that quantitative analysis. Once that data has been captured within the risk assessment, we're now looking at the workflow. And the workflow essentially says we've captured the risk data. We now need to have a quality assurance check to take it from an unapproved state to an approved state. And once it's in the approved state, then we know that the risk is fit for purpose and that the quality is appropriate for inclusion in our future models. Now, of course, risks have a natural life cycle, and after they've been approved, we would work through the treatment actions, and then we would close the risk out. And we follow all of those life cycle processes, and we can record those, as you would have seen on the dashboard, from unapproved to approved to closed. Now, there's many other features within the tool, and we don't have enough time here today to explain them to you all. However, as Chris mentioned, we're very happy to give local one-to-one demonstrations and to provide any detailed answers that you may have to our questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Steve to answer or to take any of your questions, and we'll answer them with the last 10 minutes which we have.
Well, thank you, Mark. You know I'm not capable of answering the questions. That's for you and Chris to do. I'm going to let Chris moderate the questions, but I wanted to jump in and remind you to type in your questions into the questions section. And if we don't get to them all today, I apologize up front, but we will follow up with you with an email or a call to make sure your questions are answered. Secondly, I wanted to encourage you to write in that questions menu or in the chat section if you're interested in an in-depth demo of Safran Risk Manager or even a trial, so that we can get back to you and follow up and make sure that happens. So thanks again. I will turn the rest of the Q&A over to Chris and to Mark, and then I'll jump back in a little bit. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. Okay, so we've got some questions here, Mark, and there's a couple that actually marry up nicely together. So there's a question about the ability to design your own PID matrix, so the likelihood, probability, impact diagram. And then there's another question that's about hierarchical risk levels and rolling up together projects into programs and such like. So okay. I think probably those two questions done at the same time, I think. Okay,
wonderful. So as I mentioned earlier, I've got the role here of administrator. So I'm the administrator for the tool. And under the administration window, I have the ability to change my risk scores. As mentioned, we've got the ability to have 3 levels of risk score, and I've just opened up my level 1. Now, level 1 consists of 3 impact types and 3 likelihood types to give me a 3x3 matrix, and I can show that. Each one of these matrices is configurable, so I can add additional impacts and I can add additional likelihoods. I can also change such things as the color scheme which we want to use for each of the cells based on their particular score. And it's also worth noting that we have not only a threat matrix at this level, but also an opportunity matrix. And it is possible that the level for the within the same level, we can have a different matrix for opportunity than we do for threat. So I could specifically tailor my opportunity matrix to have more or less columns or rows within that matrix. So that answers the first question about the scoring system, the PID system. And then the second question we have is about organization. So each organization will be different. And within the risk administration tool, we have the ability to configure an organization structure. And the organization structure would essentially sit from a corporate headquarters down to a division, then maybe down to a program. And within that program, you may wish to nest your projects. So I've got a very simple construction of the organization here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to jump back into Risk Register and graphically represent that under a project. So if I open a project, I can open my project level, and this is the graphical representation of the hierarchical structure. And you can see here I've got a division which is called Ship Radar Division, and underneath here I've got a Project Blue Sky, and underneath the Project Blue Sky I've got the Project Dark Horizon. So you can see how the individual projects can sit in a hierarchical structure aligned to the organization of the company. Hopefully that answers you, Chris.
Did you show the dashboard and been able to put multiple projects on?
Yes, I mentioned multiple projects on the dashboard.
Yes, do that there, and also the portfolio view. Yeah. Okay, so let's go for another one. So can you bulk edit risks by field? So you can on some, can't you, Mark? So
yes, we can. So there are some limited bulk edit functionality. So I'm now in my risk register here, and I can select individual risks within my risk register. Okay, so I've now selected 4 risks, and with this update risk, I'm enabled to change such things as the owner, or the status, or the function which has been assigned to that particular risk. And just simply a case of, if I change the owner here to Christ Ritson, sorry Chris, give you some work to do. When I hit save, these risks will now have changed their ownership to Chris. So there is a possibility to change some of these functions on bulk.
Okay, there's somebody noticed that we had up to 3 actions linked to sources and 3 actions linked to impacts, and they're wondering, is that a limitation of 3? And I believe the answer is it's a current limitation, but it's actually something that technically doesn't need to be limited, and we're probably changing that. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we placed the limit on 3 because we couldn't imagine there to be more than 3 individual actions per source or per impact. Bear in mind, there's an unlimited number of sources and an unlimited number of impacts that can be identified per risk event. So it is possible to have many more than 3 actions per risk, but they're only limited to a source and an impact. So it is technically not a limitation on the number of actions per risk, only to numbers per source or per impact.
Okay, there's a question on historical trending of risk exposures and score comparisons and such like. I don't think we've got so much in the way of that at the moment. I know that we've got the ability to lock data for auditing purposes and trending, doing some limited trending, but maybe you could show.
Okay, so one of the things I didn't mention was the idea of the portfolio viewer, and portfolio viewer allows you to gather multiple projects together. So I'm going to pick up my risk, well, the projects which I have under my risk radar division again. And from here, I'm able to then run reports across that multiple portfolio, which includes, for example, how much contingency has moved between one month and another month. And from this report, I will be able to see what my change in held contingency has been across my portfolio of projects. So that's one of the limited number of trend analyses which we could potentially show.
Okay. There's a question about opportunities and are they incorporated into the Monte Carlo simulation? I think that's just a straight yes. In this, as I said, that is correct, isn't it?
Need to contradict there, Chris.
Okay.
Monte Carlo on the dashboard will only take into consideration threat cost data. Okay. It would not be appropriate to offset threat impact data with opportunity, which may or may not be seized upon. So for the very basic Monte Carlo analysis on the dashboard, we only look at threat, cost, impact. Now, that's not to say that when you connect the data set into Safran Risk, you can do a Monte Carlo on opportunity, Monte Carlo on threat, and you can mix and match the two. So it's much more sophisticated to do an analysis of opportunity in Safran Risk, but we limit it to only threat data on Risk Manager in this view.
Yeah, and I think it flows into the next question nicely, which is what are the limitations of the Monte Carlo here compared to, say, what we do in Safran Risk. So here it's a 1,000 iteration. I mean, what are the parameters?
Yeah, it's exact. So we use a fixed seed and 1,000 iterations on the approved threats within the risk register. And again, it's looking for such items as the long tail or the what I call the humps, where we have risk values accumulating around separate values on the impact.
Okay, and then the next one that came in was about how many assessments can you have: inherent, current, post, mitigated, target, etc. So they've listed about 4 different ones there.
Okay.
We only have the 2 here at the moment, don't we? So
yes, we do. We have pre-treatment and post-treatment. So through our feedback with our beta testers, we felt that having those 2 simple ones of before you've done something about the risk and after you've done something about the risk would be sufficient for the majority of the people who wanted to make use of this tool.
okay, and there's a question about workflows in terms of email notifications. Perhaps you want to explain
Yep.
how that currently works and how it's going to work.
Okay, so at the moment we have a limited capability on emailing, which is limited to the project manager or the risk manager, and we enable them to manually trigger notifications on such things as how many actions a user has which has exceeded its completion date, or actions which haven't started on the date which they were anticipated. And it's quite simple. We have got a set list of emails which we can select, and when we hit the trigger email, it will then email to those users associated with my project that type of information. Now, we're going to move forward on that, and we're going to incorporate some auto triggers such that when the administration configure it, we could allow notifications to occur on an hourly basis, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. Obviously, that would be dependent on the type of organization which you have. Clearly, some projects make changes on a very regular basis, and other projects will only make changes on a very few and far between. So we obviously need to incorporate some means of tailoring and configuring the auto generation of emails. But as it currently stands, we've kept that very much under the control of the project team management.
Okay.
Chris, I'm conscious of the time. I believe it's...
I was just going to say, yeah, I'm just going to squeeze one more in because there are lots more questions being asked. The last one I was going to say, can I import risks from Excel? Yes, you can.
Yes, you can. Yep. Each project enables you to import very easily using an import template from a CSV file.
Yeah, and I think this is our brand new tool, and you know the development is ongoing at quite a pace at the moment. We've had lots of feedback from different people on the tool. We've got a list as long as our arms, and we are incorporating lots of new features as we go. So any more feedback, any more questions that you have, please do keep them coming. But connect with us, and some of you've indicated that you're interested in having trials and demos, so that's wonderful. So thank you very much for that.